Hello and welcome to the Zen Gateway for uh, today, which is, of course, the 28th of July. So, welcome to everybody. We're just going to give our usual few moments for people to jump in and to before we begin. Um, so, today I've got a slightly longer piece. This is a story that takes place in the 19th century in Japan regarding a Zen master called Master Kendo, whose name is obviously very similar to the martial art that uses swords and sticks, but I don't think he has any actual connection with it. And this is it's a story that takes place at a just before a pivotal point in Japanese history, which is that it takes place before the Meiji Restoration. And the Meiji Restoration, which took place in 1866 in Japan, was really the time when Japan began to become a lot less insular, and there was a move to modernize it. That is to link it up in the Western sense, and this brought in some radical reforms, both for the samurai, who were basically disbanded by that. The samurai were the Japanese nobility, and also it was a big change for Buddhism as well, because up until this time, Buddhist priests had been celibate, or Buddhist monks had always been celibate, but now they were forced to marry. And that has been retained and carries over into the modern day. So nowadays, Zen monks will go to the training sodo as young men in order to train, and then afterwards they have a second ordination by which they become priests, and then they can go and start families. Okay, good morning to everybody. Good morning, Roger. Good morning, David. Good morning, Dees. Good morning, Linda. Good to see everybody. And Carolyn. Good. All right, nice to see everybody. So, um, just to say, I did give a notice a few weeks back that we would be drawing these at home to the at home with the Zen Gateway series to an end. And that is going to happen really because we've originally it was designed to give us a little bit of spiritual uplift during the lockdown, and now although we're all wearing masks and socially distancing still, we are officially out of the lockdown, at least for now. So today, I'm afraid, is going to be the last one in this series. However, there's always plenty of material that's being posted up on the Zen Gateway, including lots of talks. And certainly it's proved to have been popular. So we will have something. We will keep something going, but I'm just pondering about it at the moment. We'll see how that goes. So today will be the last in this series at home with the Zen Gateway, but stay tuned because we're not going anywhere. In fact, at the Zen Gateway, we are looking to expand our repertoire. Anyway, enough of that, and on to our story. Before the Meiji Restoration of 1868, Zen Master Kendo, a great spiritual figure, was master of the Yokonji Temple at Saiki in Kyushu. This was the temple of the Mori clan, and one of their chief retainers had taken to unbridled extravagance and luxury, and was sunk in a life of dissoluteness. The master, thinking it a pity, remonstrated with him a few times, but instead of listening, he resented the interference and began to search for some pretext to have the master disgraced. The master, however, was one of very holy life, inwardly and outwardly pure, without a single opening for criticism. But a rumour arose that every night the master, when the rest had gone to sleep, used to have a sumptuous meal in the privacy of his room. The retainer seized on this, and when all was dark, crept into the temple garden and up to the master's room. He confirmed that the master was eating with apparent relish. Full of joy at having caught his enemy, he presented himself the next day at the court of the feudal lord. The head of the Mori clan was Lord Takayasu, a man of intelligence and furthermore a devout follower of the master. But when he heard the story he was taken back, and thinking it must be true, concealed himself in the garden the next night. When he peeped into the master's room, sure enough the master was eating away. Without more ado, Lord Takayasu burst through the window into the room. The surprised master quickly covered the bowl from which he was eating and put it out of sight, and then inquired, "To what urgent affair do we owe the honour of a visit at this unusual hour? Please pardon the absence of ceremony in receiving your grace." The Lord replied sternly, "There is no room for pardoning here. What have you just hidden away?" The master earnestly asked that the matter be overlooked, repeatedly excusing himself and bowing to the ground. The nobleman refused to listen, and made to seize the bowl by force, upon which the master reluctantly showed him its contents. He said, "I am ashamed that this should have come to the notice of your grace. There are many student monks who come here from different parts of the country, and though I am always impressing on them not to waste even a drop of water, or throw away lightly a scrap of vegetable or grain of rice, there are so many of them, and most of them young, that in spite of all I say, the cut-off ends of vegetables and rice leavings still get thrown away down the kitchen waste pipe. To stop this waste, I've fixed a small sieve at the end, and when they're all asleep, I collect what is in it, boil it, and have it for my own evening meal. I've been doing this now for many years. I very much regret that such a sordid story should trouble your august ears." Hearing this, the Lord was profoundly moved, and with tears in his eyes, begged that his own conduct be excused. So I think this is a really nice story to finish on, because there are, I think, many things that we can very easily identify with here. Not only tales of gossip and rumour and placing people up on pedestals and then wanting to rip them down, but also extremely important as well about not wasting. And I think that's really the main point that we should take away from this story, and particularly in our time, when we're going through some very radical changes and are going to see more radical changes, changes in lifestyle, changes in income, and the habits that we have been used to, the conveniences that we have been used to, and the way that we easily get used to things and perhaps take things for granted, really does need to change, not only for ourselves personally, but also as a society and very much as a planet as well. But let's just start. Let's just start at the beginning, because really, as I said, this is Master Kendo was obviously an advisor to the Lord Takayasu, who looked very much up to him. And it's interesting when we look up to somebody, particularly if they are aspiring to live a noble life. There's certainly something that we look up to, and to be honest, all our heroes and heroines have this quality, or have some kind of quality that we admire and that we naturally want to look up to. And this is a very common human trait. But there's also something else as well, and that is that if in our own heart we feel inferior to that, we feel deficient, I don't like it, do I? I mean, it rubs me up the wrong way. And so even though on the one hand we want to look up to somebody, on the other hand we are also jealous as well, or perhaps a little envious as well, and that causes us to want to tear down as well. And I remember Myokyoni saying, she said that there are these two attitudes in us. There's the one that wants to look up, and there's the other that wants to sort of tear it down as well. And if we look at, celeb culture, this is just what is happening, what plays out in the media before our eyes all the time. But there's nothing new about this. This is something that was always going on, and it was certainly, when reading this story, one of the things that jumped out at me was that when the master heard about this rumor about Master Kendo, he, despite the fact that he looked up to him, he thought it must be true. Isn't it? It's interesting. We want to believe it. And particularly now. And I know when we're doing when I there's an exercise that I give to in one of the classes on the Wheel of Life, where we look at the 6 states on the Wheel of Life, which we've talked about a number of times already. And one of them is that human state. And in the Eastern view, the human state is the best of what it is to be human. So the most noble of what it is to be human. In the West, we tend to think of being human as a sort of weakness, almost like to err is human, and well, I'm only human, that sort of thing. But actually, in the East, to be human is something that we aspire to. And the other states, the hungry ghosts and the fighting demons, etc., even the gods and the miserable beings, these are non-human states that lead us astray and cause suffering. So when we consider the human, one of the things we can consider in that human realm is that this is all those heroic traits can be thought of. So anybody who has, I mean, like the Buddha is a hero; he's a spiritual hero. So was Christ as well, and Muhammad. They try to live a good life, and they try to teach a better way of living. And there are other people who have endured great difficulty. Nelson Mandela obviously comes to mind, and yet stay true to their commitment and their cause. And there are people who just, there are people in the news as well who do wonderful things for charity, for example. They are dedicated and selfless, and want to do good for others as well as themselves. And these are traits that we look up to. And even sports people as well are another example. These are people who are very determined, and they see the task through to the very end, and they make sacrifices in order to become the best in their field. Musicians, artists, or also writers as well. I mean, and even we were clapping for the NHS workers, weren't we? Because we were recognizing their great value, and the fact that we are very dependent on the work that they do, and that they were exposing themselves to greater danger as well. So all these things are heroic, and they naturally cause us to look up, and we want to look up, and it's a great aspect in the human heart to want to aspire. And when we come to Buddhism, we have this as well. We have the Bodhisattva path, the path that leads to be of benefit to all beings and to attain Buddhahood for oneself, but also for the benefit of all beings as well. So this is a trait that goes back a long, long way. But there's also that caution as well, and there is also that thing that we can become carried away with our ideals. And there's that lovely story of Master Ikkyu, which I think we may have looked at in a previous talk, when he was raising money because Daitokuji, the great training monastery, got burned down again. And this was back in the sort of 1400s, I think. It got burned down, and he was hauled in to basically get some crowdfunding going. So he had to he had to go and sort of soft soap the donors, the wealthy people, and get them to pay money so that they could rebuild it again. And so in return, obviously, he got invited to all sorts of sort of posh do's and dinners, because those donors wanted everyone to see that they were rubbing shoulders with the great Master Ikkyu, the great master who was Lord High Abbot of Daitokuji, and these look at the good works that I am doing. And so, one gets the feeling that he probably got a bit sick of this. And so one day, when he was invited to a particular donor, he turned up in beggar's clothes and got turned away. Went home, put on his Lord High Abbot robe, and then turned up, and he was welcomed in, and everybody was sort of kowtowing and so forth. And they sort of, went to show him his seat, and he took his robe off and he placed the robe on the seat and said, "Well, I turned up earlier, and you turned me away, but when I came with the robe, you let me in. So I presume it's the robe that you want at your dinner. I'll go now." And off he went. And it was a very sort of classic Ikkyu way of making that point, that we can get carried away by the outer trappings of things as well, and that's not necessarily a good thing. And then, of course, the other side of this, of course, is the gossip. The fact that there was this rumor going round. And, sometimes we wonder, well, there's no smoke without fire. Well, yes, that can be true, but there's a difference between a candle flame and a conflagration, and it has a whole different emphasis as well. So it's worth remembering that. I remember many years ago when I was working at the union, and I remember the head of finance. I had a phone call from the head of finance. His wife wife was pregnant, and he take it. She wasn't well, and so he'd taken her to hospital, and so he said he wouldn't be in, and that happened at about 10 o'clock in the morning, and by about 4 o'clock. The rumour came back to me that he'd been involved in a terrible car accident and was now fighting for his life in hospital. It was only because I'd actually taken the call that I knew the truth. But obviously, someone had heard that he wasn't there, he'd gone to hospital, and then this other fabricated story just sort of appeared out of the mists of sort of febrile and maybe a slightly bored imagination. And this is one of the things, why do we enjoy this sort of gossip, particularly celeb gossip? It's titillation, really, isn't it? And there's nothing new there. You can go back to the old English pamphlets of the 18th century, which were often quite scurrilous political pamphlets about people's behaviour and tut-tutting, and all that sort of thing. But to be honest, these sorts of rumours, they're not genuine simply because they're appealing to an emotion that we're trying to get away from. As I say, usually something like boredom or maybe feelings of inferiority. Um, and actually, the problem is they cover those things up. When we do not act genuinely, when we act disingenuously, then we're not being true to ourselves. We're not actually being true to the real motivations that are in our heart. And so we don't help ourselves because we don't address the real underlying problems. If we are constantly bored, if it may be that we're actually living the wrong life, it may be that we're pretending to be something that we're not, in which case it's those things that are the real problem, not the fact that I simply must get my gossip fix, um, in order to make myself feel somebody. So this is something. This is why living that genuine life is so important. And the master here, when we hear that he was living a very good life, we shouldn't mix it up to think that somehow he never made mistakes. I remember Sokoroshi addressing this once. He said, "You look up to me," he says, "because I'm the Roshi." He says, "But do you honestly think I don't make mistakes?" He said, "Just this morning I was eating some scrambled eggs for breakfast, and I sneezed, and I blasted eggs all over the table chair in front of me." He says, "I do that all the time." Right. This is, and again, this is something that comes from this putting things on too high a pedestal. Yes, it's good to look up to something, but be aware of that tendency to over idealize, because then we suffer from disappointment when we discover that, first our parents are human, then those heroes in childhood were also human and were fallible as well. And then we can swing to the opposite extreme where we become the pervert, the cynic who sees no good in anyone. You know, but the interesting thing about a cynic is that if you scratch the surface of a cynic, what you find is a frustrated idealist underneath. The reason people are so cynical is because they want to be idealist, but they feel that they can't. Either they've been disappointed, maybe, or maybe they're afraid. Maybe they're afraid that if they give their faith and their heart to something, it will be disappointed again. And of course, in a world that's subject to change, this is going to happen. However, we have to remember that ideals are not states to be attained once and for all, because in a world that's subject to change, that can never happen. There is no end state in a world that is constantly subject to change, and there are no absolutes either. However, there are ideals, and even there are ideals in Buddhism, like the Bodhisattva ideal or the Arhat ideal. And what ideals do is they provide us with a signpost. They provide us with a direction in which to walk, even if we don't make it to the end. The point is we've moved a little further in that direction. And that is a good thing. That is a valuable thing, and certainly something to be valued in oneself and in others. It's not the mistakes I make or the mistakes you make. It's actually the virtue that's behind it. It's the striving to attain. that I think is needs to be valued more. We're very quick to judge and do things down in others and in ourselves as well. This cuts both ways, inwardly and outwardly. But it's often a lot more difficult to really appreciate the efforts that we do make and to recognize that they too have a virtue and a power. So perhaps just keeping that a little bit in mind. And that really brings us to the last point that I think is the real takeaway for this, and this is the master's endeavor that he recognized there was waste going on, and in Zen and in all Buddhism actually, waste is something, and throwing things away is something that is taken very seriously. The admonition not to waste things, um, not to give up lightly on things, to make the effort with things. Otherwise, we very easily cease to appreciate their value. And certainly when it comes to things like food, this is most important. And again, I mean, I remember when I was living in Japan, we didn't throw anything away. Food was recycled, and even the water that we boiled the peas in would be made into soup. You just add a little bit of salt, and you have a sort of clear soup, and you could just sort of drink it with your evening meal. These things were done all the time, and people obviously would bring food to a temple. So, as cook, which I was for a number of years, you never know exactly what people are going to bring, and people bring all sorts of stuff. I mean, some people I think do just sort of clear out their cupboards and take their stuff um, to the temple, as it were, because it's been sitting in their pantries for a while. So you get all sorts of jars of strange things that come in, and I mean, we used them. We had to do something with them. Um, so this is something that's worth pondering. Particularly now. Things are going to be difficult, I think, for a number of people, what with one thing and another, and now a sort of make do and mend, a more practical attitude, maybe the thing to really do. But what comes with that is a sense of appreciation, a sense of um, uh, that just as things come to us, they can also be taken away. And again, actually, overbuying things, just and living a sort of life of waste, which is how this story starts. The master, is basically has a bit of a go at one of the chief retainers who's sort of taken to unbridled luxury. I mean, one of those things of unbridled luxury, you may sort of think, oh, maybe he's boozing his head off or something, but actually, it can just be like what we call retail therapy. I mean, if you are a retail therapist, if you're a person that sort of goes and buys things to make yourself feel better, the problem is not getting the next pair of shoes. The problem is what's wrong with your life that you have to go and buy a pair of shoes to make yourself feel better. I remember I was working when I worked for someone a few years ago, and she was having a very hard time at work. There's a lot of pressure on her, and finally she handed a notice in, and I was chatting to her, and she said, "Yeah, yeah." She said, "I realised." She said, "Every day I would come in and I'd have breakfast before I could set off from work, and then I would stop off at the sandwich shop and get myself a bacon sandwich to make myself feel better. And one day I thought to myself, what am I doing? That I have to that I'm eating a bacon sandwich in order to make myself feel better. There's something wrong here." And it's easy, we can fall into those sort of habits. Um, and instead of reading the signs and saying, well, what does this habit actually say? What does it mean? What is it saying about the life that I'm living? Is it the right life? Does something need to change? Does something need to be addressed? We can just do these things very blindly. And I think in times of austerity, in times of need, when we can no longer indulge ourselves to the same degree as we have in the past, then we really have to pay attention. And I think, this is something that's important from a sort of self-learning point of view, but it goes deeper than that. It's also about how we relate to the world and the things in the world around us, and it's about setting the markers for the relationship, whether we regard the world as there for my convenience, or whether we feel ourselves a part of a greater whole. And I want to finish with with one of my favorite stories, which is the story that Soko Morinaga Roshi tells when he first met his first teacher, Master Zuigan. And this was after the Second World War. And the story is, I mean, he tells it beautifully in his Pointers to Insight. So he was a young man. He came from a wealthy family, but at the end of the war, because Japan lost, all the land was taken away from them and was redistributed. So the family land that would have been his inheritance was taken away from him. And he said a lot of people turned to criminality. A lot of young men turned to criminality at that time. And he said it could have easily happened to him too. But he was interested in philosophy, but they were interested in real philosophical questions. That is, you know, we have been lied to. Was basically it. They were told the emperor was, the supreme being, and they'd lost the war and they'd done these terrible things, and they realized it was fake. And he said, we couldn't trust anybody. We couldn't trust what our elders, the people whom we've been told to trust, we couldn't trust a thing, anything that they could say to us. We couldn't trust anymore. We had a complete loss of faith. And this was the state he was in when he went to see Zwegan. And Zwegan listened to him pouring his heart out for a couple of hours and didn't say a word. And at the very end of it, he said, you know, if you want me to help you, then you are going to have to trust me. And Soko, was really taken aback and bridled at this because he thought, has this fool not listened to a word that I've been saying for the past 2 hours? I can't trust anybody. But he realized that if he said that, then he'd have nowhere else to go. And that was the thing. This was his last stop. And so he lied and he said, okay, I'll trust you. So the master said, well, in that case, the first job I'm giving you, I want you to go and sweep the temple paths. Now, the gardens in Zen temples are designed that the leaves are falling throughout the 12 months of the year, so there's always stuff to sweep up. And so he did. And he was very enthusiastic, and he swept it into a big pile, and he sort of bounced over to um, Master Swegan and said, well, I've done all that, so what do I do with all the rubbish? And Swegan looked at him and he said, what rubbish? And he said, this. He pointed it to. He said, that isn't rubbish. He said, those leaves can be used for kindling to heat the bath water. And Soko realized, he said, oh, well, I suppose that's true. He said, go and get some sacks from the shed. So he did. He got the sacks from the shed and put them all in. And when he'd pulled the last of the sacks away and had come back, he saw the master kneeling down, picking out all the little bits of stone and gravel. And he went around the eaves of the buildings. Those Japanese buildings, the water runs down, it drops down, and makes little indentations in the gravel that surrounds the building. And he was going around filling those little indentations up with the gravel stone that he'd picked up. And then he came back, and all that was left was some bits of moss and some twigs. And of course, the Japanese have these moss gardens, and so he picked up the moss and went over to the rocks, and where the monk's shoes had scuffed the moss off the rocks, he carefully placed all those little sort of bits of moss back into the spaces that had been made by those scuffing shoes. And finally, he came back to and looked Soko in the eye. There was nothing left, and he said to him, "In the beginning, there is no rubbish in either people or in things. In the beginning, there is no rubbish either in people or in things." And what he was saying was that what we call rubbish is a conception in our own mind. It is that for which we will throw away. And when we do that, we are indulging in the whole world of desire, of samsara, of acquisition, things that I like, and getting rid of things that I don't like, and denying the truth of the world, that the world is in forever in constant transformation, one thing to another. And this is so true. And I think this is a teaching that can be put into actual practice in one's own life. Don't throw food away. Organize your life so that you don't throw anything away, and that you make as much use of things as you possibly can. You can compost things. You can do all sorts of things. Even if you haven't got a garden, if you've just got something like a terrace or maybe a balcony with some plants on, you can still recycle. But that's just the beginning of it. It's not just things, it's also people as well. Appreciating people around us, even people that we don't necessarily get on with. It's amazing how, if we cultivate good relations and cultivate goodwill with people, just generally, it doesn't necessarily have to be best friends with everybody. You can't be best friends with everybody. But to be on as good terms as we possibly can with the people around us. From one's own experience, one never knows when one needs help and from what direction that would come. And the more links that we have in the world around us, then really the better it is for our own survival and for the survival of others. Giving ourselves to the welfare of others means that they will give something of themselves to us as well. And in this way, we stand a much better chance of developing resilience in a difficult world and at difficult times as well. Okay, well, I'm going to leave it there. We've had our half hour. So those of you who come in a little bit late, you can always get it on catch up a little bit later. But just to repeat, this is going to be the last At Home with the Zen Gateway. We are out of lockdown now, even though we're living in the so-called new normal. However, not to worry, there's plenty of material that's always being put up on a weekly basis on the Zen Gateway at thezengateway.com. Also, if you have any questions with regard to practice, do send them over to the Zen Gateway at gmail.com. And we will be there'll be some announcements later on in the year about the new program that we're going to be rolling out over the Zen Gateway. So stay tuned, and until then, stay well, and a good, fulfilling continuation walking along the Buddha's path to that ancient city that is called the human heart. Good luck with that, and see you all again very soon. Thank you.